Hey Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually came to me while discussing last week's video in the comments section. It's about the Grey Havens. Somebody brought up the idea of, hey, was Círdan, Lord of the Grey Havens, present at the White Council? Spoiler alert, he was. But that got me thinking, oh, the White Council, perfect. That would be an excellent topic for a video. Did a little research on it and found some really awesome quotes to use for this. Thanks to Unfinished Tales and the Silmarillion, we've got actual dialogue between White Council members. It's not simply a date on a calendar. Meeting of the White Council. No, it's like, whoa, we actually have Gandalf getting in an argument with Saruman about Sauron and the Ring. So this is really, really pivotal stuff. If you saw the Hobbit trilogy, you'll know that Peter Jackson did a version of the White Council in those movies. He's got Galadriel and Elrond and Saruman and Gandalf all meeting. And in fact, the White Council did meet at that time during the quest to Erebor. So that is accurate in timing. However, some of the stuff they discuss in the movies is not from the books. For instance, when they discuss the ring race being buried in these tombs in the high fells, that's not a thing from the books. Not exactly sure why Peter Jackson decided he needed to put that in there. I'm thinking maybe just to give a sense of urgency when, you know, Gandalf goes to investigate those tombs and then like, and then has to go to Dol Guldur. Maybe it just felt for movie terms that he needed to give Gandalf a little more momentum. But some of the other facets of the movie version of the White Council are from the books. Specifically, the fact that Saruman is constantly an obstacle to the White Council making progress. And one of the things we see from these various quotes I'm about to read you is that Saruman, for a long time, has designs on the ring and just trying to keep the White Council at bay long enough to get this thing for himself. Hence, the White Council is a failure because they picked the wrong guy to lead it. Think, in fact, of the Council of Elrond, which, you know, obviously takes place in Lord of the Rings. This is after the last White Council meeting. That council, very effective, right? Does a lot of good stuff, including destroying the One Ring. And that's because Elrond is leading it, someone who is not secretly attempting to sabotage the entire purpose of the meeting. So, let's break down the chronology of our White Council meetings. There is actually a version of the White Council that meets in the Second Age. We hear about this in the Unfinished Tales. And I'll read you that passage in a second. But what we consider to be kind of the White Council that people know about has 4 recorded meetings in the Third Age. So I'm just going to kind of take them chronologically. So first up, here's a quote from the Unfinished Tales about kind of our first inkling of a White Council. It occurs in the Second Age in the year 1701. In the Battle of the Gwathlo, Sauron was routed utterly, and he himself only narrowly escaped. Broken and humiliated, he returned to Mordor and vowed vengeance upon Numenor. The army that was besieging Imladris was caught between Elrond and Gil-galad and utterly destroyed. Erebor was cleared of the enemy, but lay largely in ruins. At this time, the first council was held, and it was there determined that an elvish stronghold in the east of Erebor should be maintained at Imladris, Rivendell, rather than in Eregion. At that time, also, Gil-galad gave Vilya the blue ring to Elrond, and appointed him to be his vice-regent in Erebor. But the red ring he kept, until he gave it to Círdan when he set out from Lindon in the days of the last alliance. Now, right after that is this great footnote Christopher Tolkien inserts. The text was amended to read the First White Council. Originally it says the First Council. So Tolkien amended it to say the First White Council. In the Tale of Years, the formation of the White Council is given under the year 2463 of the Third Age, which we're about to talk about. But it may be that the name of the Council of the Third Age deliberately echoed that of this council, held long before. The more especially as several of the chief members of the one had been members of the other. Right? You've got Círdan and Elrond, probably Galadriel, and they're all meeting now in the Third Age, basically about the same topic, Sauron. So they decide to echo this name, the White Council, that they had used all those thousands of years earlier. So, as that quote mentioned, the first meeting of the White Council in the Third Age is from 2463, which again is several years, over 500 years before the War of the Ring. But I'm going to take you back just slightly before that, because there's this thing called the watchful peace. In fact, in Peter Jackson's version of the White Council, you hear Elrond mention like a watchful peace. So he's actually mentioning this particular moment. This is Gandalf going to Dol Guldur, chasing away Sauron, and issuing in this watchful peace. You'll hear the names Mithrandir, obviously that's Gandalf, and Curanir, that's another name for Saruman. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and he it was that most doubted the darkness in Mirkwood. For though many deemed that it was wrought by the ring-wraiths, he feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning. And he went to Dol Guldur, and the sorcerer fled from him, and there was a watchful peace for a long while. But at length the shadow returned, and its power increased, and in that time, 2463, was first made the Council of the Wise, that is called the White Council. And therein were Elrond, and Galadriel, and Círdan, and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir and Curanir. And Curanir was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great. But Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place, nor be subject to any summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the Rings of Power, their making, and their history. Okay, so watchful peace actually lasts for 400 years. In 2063, Gandalf goes to Dol Guldur, suspecting that Sauron is there. Sauron, sensing Gandalf apparently has come, retreats, flees. And that's 400 years then, go what they call the watchful peace, until finally Sauron starts to come back. And so it's this time then when this meeting happens and they choose a leader, and Galadriel wants to choose Gandalf. Gandalf refuses leadership of the White Council, and instead it's Saruman that is chosen. Interestingly too, 2463, the year of the council, is also the year that Dagel finds the ring and is quickly killed off by his brother Sméagol. Galadriel actually has an interesting comment about this meeting in the Fellowship of the Ring. So this is where the Fellowship has arrived in Lothlorien, and she's welcoming the group. She's talking to Frodo, and she says this. "Your quest is known to us," said Galadriel, looking at Frodo, "but we will not here speak of it more openly. Yet not in vain will it prove, maybe, that you came to this land seeking aid, as Gandalf himself plainly purposed. I it was who first summoned the White Council, and if my designs had not gone amiss, it would have been governed by Gandalf the Grey, and then, mayhap, things would have gone otherwise." So, interesting. She is the one who summoned the White Council in the first place, and then she's saying, yeah, I wanted Gandalf to lead this thing. Things would have been a lot different if only Gandalf hadn't turned down the office. I find it interesting that earlier quote mentions, who was in attendance at the White Council, and it says other lords of the Eldar. So that opens it up, right? It's not simply the group that we're talking about. There are some unnamed folks that were there. So who might that be? I'd have to think one of those would be Glorfindel, right? If I had to pick one other person that was there, that's not one of the Istari, is not Galadriel, is not Círdan, is not Elrond, it's got to be Glorfindel. Celeborn would be another potential option. So if you've got some thoughts on who else might have been in the White Council, feel free to put it down in the comments. So now we jump to the second recorded council. And that happens about 400 years after the first council. This is 2851. And in 2850, this is when Gandalf again returns to Dol Guldur and ends up finding Thrain II, Thorin's dad. This kind of sets off the whole, what eventually becomes the quest to Erebor. With this information he's got from being in Dol Guldur and speaking with Thrain II, he then returns to the council. And this is some of the best stuff. There's this great fight, essentially, between Saruman and Gandalf that has a lot of implications for what comes later. This first part is from the Silmarillion. Now the shadow grew ever greater. Therefore, on a time, Mithrandir, at great peril, went again to Dol Guldur in the pits of the sorcerer, and he discovered the truth of his fears, and escaped. And returning to Elrond, he said, True, alas, is our guess. This is not one of the Ulairi, ringwraiths, as many have long supposed. It is Sauron himself who has taken shape again and now grows apace, and he is gathering again all the rings to his hand, and he seeks ever for news of the One, and of the heirs of Isildur, if they still live on earth. And Elrond answered, In the hour that Isildur took the ring and would not surrender it, this doom was wrought, that Sauron should return. Yet the One was lost, said Mithrandir, and while it still lies hid, we can master the enemy, if we gather our strength and tarry not too long. Then the White Council was summoned, 2851, and Mithrandir urged them to swift deeds. But Curanir spoke against him, and counseled them to wait yet, and to watch. For I believe it not, said he, that the One will ever be found again in Middle-earth. Into Anduin it fell, and long ago, I deem, it was rolled to the sea. There it shall lie until the end, when all this world is broken, and the deeps are removed. Okay, so I'm going to read some more about this meeting in just a second, but just to set the tone there, you've got the situation, Gandalf, he's been to Dol Guldur, he's confirmed the presence of Sauron, he's now come back and said, we need to act now, and it's Saruman who throws up the brakes. And one of the reasons he's thrown up the brakes is that he is trying to find the ring himself. And he puts off the council by saying that the ring has probably rolled out to sea, which obviously he doesn't believe is true. Okay, this is a bit of a longer quote, but it's just too good to pass up. This is from Unfinished Tales. This is at this meeting, 2851, Saruman putting off the council from acting. And we've got this great little argument between Gandalf and Saruman. The council met in Rivendell, and Gandalf sat apart, silent, but smoking prodigiously, a thing he had never done before on such an occasion, while Saruman spoke against him, and urged that, contrary to Gandalf's advice, Dol Guldur should not yet be molested. Both the silence and the smoke seemed greatly to annoy Saruman, and before the council dispersed, he said to Gandalf, When weighty matters are in debate, Mithrandir, I wonder a little that you should play with your toys of fire and smoke, while others are in earnest speech. But Gandalf laughed and replied, You would not wonder if you used this herb yourself. You might find that smoke blown out cleared your mind of shadows within. Anyway, it gives patience to listen to error without anger. But it is not one of my toys. It is an art of the little people away in the west, merry and worthy folk, though not of much account perhaps in your high policies. Saruman was little appeased by this answer, for he hated mockery, however gentle. And he said then coldly, You jest, Lord Mithrandir, as is your way. I know well enough that you have become a curious explorer of the small, weeds, wild things, and childish folk. Your time is your own to spend if you have nothing worthier to do, and your friends you may make as you please. But to me the days are too dark for wanderers' tales, and I have no time for the simples of peasants. Gandalf did not laugh again, and he did not answer. But looking keenly at Saruman, he drew on his pipe and sent out a great ring of smoke, with many smaller rings that followed it. Then he put up his hand as if to grasp them, and they vanished. With that he got up and left Saruman without another word. But Saruman stood for some time silent, and his face was dark with doubt and displeasure. So we see that Sauron is annoyed by Gandalf's smoking and, I say, general lack of decorum. We hear Gandalf brings up the Shire, and Saruman dismisses his actions as petty. But when Gandalf blows this smoke ring, it sets up this series of consequences, actually. I'm going to read you this description that Tolkien wrote later about how Saruman interpreted what Gandalf was doing. This story appears in half a dozen different manuscripts, and in one of them it is said that Saruman was suspicious, doubting whether he read rightly the purport of Gandalf's gesture with the rings of smoke. Above all, whether it showed any connection between the halflings and the greater matter of the rings of power, unlikely though that might seem. And doubting that one so great could concern himself with such a people as the halflings for their own sake merely. For it cannot be doubted that Gandalf had as yet no thought that the halflings, and still less their smoking, had any connection with the rings. If he had had any such thought, then certainly he would not have done what he did. Yet later, when the halflings did indeed become involved in this greatest matter, Saruman could believe only that Gandalf had known or foreknown this, and had concealed the knowledge from him and from the council, for just such a purpose as Saruman could conceive, to gain possession and to forestall him. All right, so Gandalf blows this smoke ring, tries to grab at it, and it vanishes, and he's talking about the Shire. Now, but this is way before Bilbo gets the ring. So this is saying that Gandalf really had no idea that that meant anything in terms of like, oh, eventually the ring is going to be in the Shire with Bilbo. And yet when that happens, Saruman then remembers back to this meeting and thinks, Gandalf knew all along, and he's just been trying to stall the council just like me. He's been after the ring just like me the whole time, because he projects onto Gandalf the thoughts that he himself might have. So actually, this whole thing kind of backfires in a way and becomes this real sense of enmity between these two. And so from the Silmarillion, we now see the result of this meeting that falls apart. Therefore naught was done at that time, though Elrond's heart misgave him, and he said to Mithrandir, None the less I forebode that the one will yet be found, and then war will arise again, and in that war this age will be ended. Indeed, in a second darkness it will end, unless some strange chance deliver us that my eyes cannot see. Many are the strange chances of the world, said Mithrandir, and help oft shall come from the hands of the weak when the wise falter. Thus the wise were troubled, but none as yet perceived that Curanir had turned to dark thoughts, and was already a traitor in heart. For he desired that he and no other should find the great ring, so that he might wield it himself, and order all the world to his will. And he deemed that the ring, which was Sauron's, would seek for its master as he became manifest once more. But if he were driven out again, then it would lie hid. Therefore he was willing to play with peril, and let Sauron be for a time, hoping by his craft to forestall both his friends and the enemy when the ring should appear. He set a watch upon the Gladden fields, and soon he discovered that the servants of Dol Guldur were searching all the ways of the river in that region. Then he perceived that Sauron also had learned of the manner of Isildur's end, and he grew afraid, and withdrew to Isengard and fortified it, and ever he probed deeper into the lore of the Rings of Power and the art of their forging. But he spoke of none of this to the council, hoping still that he might be the first to hear news of the ring. So we see Saruman is full-on villain at this time. He's searching Gladden Fields because that's where Isildur was killed and lost the ring. Of course, by the time he's searching for it, it's already been taken, and now Sméagol's got it. He doesn't know that. But during his searching, he starts realizing, agents of Sauron are also searching. Sauron knows about the ring. He knows how it was lost. And so he starts fortifying himself. And he moves into Isengard and starts researching even more about the Rings of Power. And I find it really interesting how he's willing to gamble with the world. Because he suspects that if they attack Sauron now and he goes away, that the ring will remain hidden. So he needs Sauron on the forefront so that the ring will attempt to return to Sauron. Hence, it will become basically findable. And then he's hoping that he can be the guy that before the ring gets back to Sauron, he takes it himself. And so he is just trying to roll a lucky 7 in this moment and gambling with a whole lot of lives. So that takes us up to the third of our 4 White Council meetings in the Third Age. This is 2941, so about 100 years later. And this is, of course, the year that Bilbo finds the ring. And we have a great quote here from Unfinished Tales where Gandalf is recounting the thought process that led him to kind of put together the dwarven quest to go return to Erebor. To resist any force that Sauron might send to regain the old lands of Angmar, there were only the dwarves of the Iron Hills, and behind them lay a desolation and a dragon. The dragon Sauron might use with terrible effect. Often I said to myself, I must find some means of dealing with Smaug, but a direct stroke against Dol Guldur is needed still more. We must disturb Sauron's plans. I must make the council see that. I was going to the Shire for a short rest after being away from it for more than 20 years. As soon as I entered the Shire, I heard news of him, Bilbo. He was getting talked about, it seemed. He could be seen talking to strangers, even dwarves. Even dwarves. Suddenly in my mind, these 3 things came together. The great dragon with his lust and his keen hearing and scent. The sturdy, heavy-booted dwarves with their old burning grudge. And the quick, soft-footed hobbit, sick at heart, I guessed, for a sight of the wide world. I laughed at myself, but I thought, I think I shall risk it. Time was getting short. I had to be with the White Council in August at the latest, or Saruman would have his way and nothing would be done. And quite apart from greater matters, that might prove fatal to the quest. The power in Dol Guldur would not leave any attempt on Erebor unhindered, unless he had something else to deal with. So this is some fascinating stuff in terms of peeking behind the curtain of Gandalf's brain. We see his mind palace as he kind of puts together these series of aspects that lead to this quest. He had kind of recently met with Thorin, so he knows about the dwarves and their grudge. He's worried about Smaug. He's worried about Sauron and Dol Guldur. And he's headed off to the Shire for this break. He hasn't been back in 20 years. Hears about Bilbo talking with the dwarves. And so he ends up crafting this plan. And the point of the plan is, if he just sets out, if he lets this group go, Sauron's not going to let it happen. Sauron has to be distracted. So he's got to get back to the White Council and convince them to attack Sauron, hence keeping him busy while this group heads off and hopefully ends up derailing the Smaug factor. So kind of similar to the way Saruman is gambling on the ring 100 years earlier. This is Gandalf with kind of a big gamble concerning Smaug and Sauron. Of course, he doesn't know about the ring at this point in this moment. So lots of gambling going on. They're in Vegas. And we have this description of this meeting, 2941, from the Unfinished Tales. This is the meeting that Peter Jackson somewhat replicates in the Hobbit movies. At last the council was again summoned, and the lore of the rings was much debated. But Mithrandir spoke to the council, saying, "It is not needed that the ring should be found, for while it abides on earth and is not unmade, still the power that it holds will live, and Sauron will grow and have hope. The might of the elves and the elf friends is less now than of old. Soon he will be too strong for you, even without the great ring, for he rules the 9, and of the 7 he has recovered 3. We must strike." To this Curanir now assented, desiring that Sauron should be thrust from Dol Guldur, which was nigh to the river, and should have leisure to search there no longer. Therefore, for the last time, he aided the council, and they put forth their strength, and they assailed Dol Guldur, and drove Sauron from his hold, and Mirkwood for a brief while was made wholesome again. But their stroke was too late, for the Dark Lord had foreseen it, and he had long prepared all his movements, and the Ulayri, his 9 servants, had gone before him to make ready for his coming. Therefore his flight was but a feint, and he soon returned, and ere the wise could prevent him, he re-entered his kingdom in Mordor, and reared once again the dark towers of Barad-dûr. So we see at this council in 2941, Saruman finally relents and decides, okay, fine, we will go attack Sauron at Dol Guldur. But the reason that Saruman relents is not some altruistic, hey, I'm doing what the Valar sent me here to do reason. No, it's, all right, by this time, I'm fairly certain the ring is around. We know Sauron's looking for it. He's probably getting really close. Let's push him away so I can finish finding this thing. And so they do successfully push Sauron out temporarily. We do see that in the Hobbit movies. But it is a very short-lived victory because Sauron takes up residence in Mordor and, boom, head for a war. So there's one last meeting recorded of the White Council. And it happens in 2953, so 12 years after the third meeting. And there's not a whole lot mentioned about it, but in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, there is this note. 2953. Last meeting of the White Council. They debate the rings. Saruman feigns that he has discovered that the one ring has passed down the Anduin to the sea. Saruman withdraws to Isengard, which he takes as his own, and fortifies it. Being jealous and afraid of Gandalf, he sets spies to watch all of his movements, and notes his interest in the Shire. He soon begins to keep agents in Bree and the South Farthing. So, yeah, we get this thing. This is the last meeting, and Saruman leaves it with a lie. Basically tries to convince the council that, oh yeah, no, I've got good information that says the ring is out to sea, so we're fine. Doesn't believe it. It's trying to throw him off. And basically, he just removes himself to Isengard permanently. One note that I find interesting, we see here that he's got spies watching Gandalf and then ends up, really checking out the Shire quite a bit. If you remember back in the earlier meeting when he's scolding Gandalf for smoking, and that's where, Gandalf reveals to him that, oh, this is from the Shire folk, Longbottom Leaf. Well, it's Longbottom Leaf that they find, Merry and Pippin find barrels of it at Isengard when Isengard falls. And so whether Saruman was just buying that stuff up to maybe economically manipulate the Shire, or perhaps whether he was smoking it himself, we're not sure. But if he was buying it and actually smoking the tobacco himself, it's kind of interesting how hypocritical he was being perhaps in that moment with Gandalf. Just another example of Saruman's underhandedness. So the White Council, in a lot of ways, was a failure, right? I mean, the one thing they did is they did manage eventually to kick Sauron out of Dol Guldur, but they did it at a time when he was ready to leave anyway. And so it just became, it was almost like he was like, hey, I've got my bags packed. Oh no, I have to leave. I'll go to Mordor and set up even more fortifications. So thanks to Saruman, the White Council was a bit of a bust. Obviously much less effective than our Council of Elrond. One last way in which I feel like the Council failed was in not foreseeing the awesome effect that the Seeing Stones might have. And so we've got a passage here from Unfinished Tales where Saruman, he got access to Orthanc through Gondor. They gave him the keys. He was like, hey, I'll be a warden of this area. But what he really wanted was access to Orthanc and what he assumed would be a Seeing Stone, and he was right. And so there's this passage from Unfinished Tales shows how the council just didn't put together how this might go south fast. Saruman had, no doubt from his investigations, gained a special knowledge of the stones, things that would attract his attention, and had become convinced that the Orthanc stone was still intact in its tower. He acquired the keys of Orthanc in 2759. At that time, the matter of the Orthanc stone would hardly concern the White Council. Only Saruman had yet made sufficient study of the records of Gondor to perceive the interest of the Palantiri and the possible uses of those that survived. But of this he said nothing to his colleagues. Again, he just kept everything to himself. The council in general must independently have known of the stones and their ancient dispositions, but they did not regard them as of much present importance. They were things that belonged to the history of the kingdoms of the Dunedain, marvelous and admirable, but mostly now lost or rendered of little use. It must be remembered that the stones were originally innocent, serving no evil purpose. It was Sauron who made them sinister and instruments of domination and deceit. It is evident that at the time of the War of the Ring, the Council had not long become aware of the doubt concerning the fate of the Ithil stone, and failed to appreciate its significance, to consider what might be the result if Sauron became possessed of one of the stones, and anyone else should then make use of another. So yeah, obviously they're like, what happened to that Ithil stone? Minas Ithil became Minas Morgul, and when Sauron took over that space, he took a stone with him. And that's the stone he used to manipulate both Saruman and Denethor. So the council wasn't putting together how dangerous it might be if Sauron is at the other end of this chat line. So there you have it. The White Council. What might have been had Gandalf accepted leadership of that council. Who knows? As Galadriel thought things would have gone much differently. I'd like to think they would have as well, although it just wasn't Gandalf's way. That's not the spirit that he was. Hope you enjoyed this video about the White Council and its kind of relative failure in some way. If you've got a topic for a video you'd like, put it in the comments. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choosing. Thanks so much, everybody, and I'll talk to you next time.